In today's video, we're looking at some additional offseason rumors. We're focusing on teams like the Maple Leafs and some additional options they have in the blue line. Should the Winnipeg Jets go through a bit of a retool, and could they possibly target a big-time defenseman like Alex Pietrangelo? Are the Pittsburgh Penguins interested in MAX Domi? We'll discuss all that and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL off-season trade and free agent rumors to discuss here today. Let's kick things off with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, of course, we heard some more additional talk from Elliotte Friedman discussing some potential players they could target to improve their blue line. Now, in the past few days, we've talked about a few different scenarios on moves they could make, mostly through trade, by trading one of their top wingers to kind of go after a higher-end defenseman, somebody who could probably partner with Morgan Rielly, be a little bit more defensive, play bigger minutes, etc. And something like that very well could happen, but they could have a very different-looking blue line. Of course, we know Barrie and Ceci likely don't return. They're going to be free agents, likely not re-signed. They do have some other younger defensemen that are kind of somewhat questionable what their role is going to be next year, or if they will be back. And we're talking about like Travis Dermott, Marty Berenson. It's debatable what their futures hold. I mean, Dermott's an RFA. He very well could be re-signed, get third pair duty, but you just never know. We've seen what happened when he was elevated to second pair duty after Jake Muzzin injury. Things didn't go well. So they very well might decide to go down the road of having a little bit more toughness and grit back there. We saw what happened when Jake Muzzin went down with an injury. He really is the only guy back there that kind of provides that, and they could use some more of that type of player on the back end. Of course, they have a lot of other younger defensemen like Lettinen and Sandin, Liljegren, going to be looking for playing time as well, but obviously we want to take the pressure off of them and make sure that they're not overwhelmed and they can get some playing time, but not be forced to play higher up in the lineup than they need to. So a couple of names mentioned by Friedman were Senators defenseman Mark Borowiecki and Capitals defender Radko Gudas. Now, both of them are at a stage in their career where they're unrestricted free agents, so they could be signed. They're not players who make a ton of money, so they could be somewhat of a budget signing to play a third pair type of a role with the Maple Leafs. Obviously, they'd add more than enough sandpaper back there. They both are known to not be afraid to drop the gloves, lay the body, play physical in front of the net, in the corners, etc. So if the Leafs want to add that type of defender, there's certainly going to be options out there on the free agent market, and it's not going to cost them a whole lot. So obviously we're going to be interested to see what kind of moves Kyle Dubas decides to make to address the roster, if they even address their style of play a little bit. They've been pretty much a run and gun offensive show for the past few years, and as much as they can be fun and exciting to watch, we have 4 years now of not getting any playoff success. I mean, they haven't won a playoff round in 16 years. They got a lot of great young players. They need to build upon that. They probably need to balance things out, but we'll see what approach Dubas takes, if he does like some minor tinkering or if he does something a little bit more substantial. As I talked about in the video a couple days ago, I would think that the possibility does exist that one of their big four gets moved, probably more so a Marner or a Nylander. I'm not sure what percentage I'd say is the likelihood it happens, but I do think that as each year goes by with playoff failures, that certainly gets ramped up and not much more. But they could decide to go down a different road, like a Janssen or a Kapanen or something to that effect, and maybe make a bit more of a minor trade. But if they address their defense through free agency, they very well could maybe trade a forward for cap space to maybe for future. So I guess we have some options out there, but these are certainly a couple players that Friedman's mentioned they could target. And really, if you think about what they're missing back there, it does make sense from a defensive and like a grit and toughness type of perspective. So let me know what your thoughts on the possibility of them going after either of these guys as free agents to address needs on their blue line. Now, another tidbit that he dropped as well, which didn't really have a lot of context around it, but I just wanted to discuss how it could work and if you guys think there's anything to it, is he mentioned kind of randomly on the podcast that he feels that MAX Domi could be a Pittsburgh Penguin, and that the Penguins could have interest to acquire him. Of course, there's been all kinds of talk about Domi in the future with Montreal. Of course, we even discussed that in yesterday's video, because there's another article again in TVA Sports talking about how his playoff utilization and playing fourth line duty kind of signals to them that maybe they don't see him as being a big part of their future, and that with the restricted free agent forward could find himself moved once the offseason comes after Montreal's season is over here. Of course, they beat the Penguins. They're so far in tough against the Flyers, so we'll see how they manage in that series, but assuming that they would, if they didn't make it against the Flyers and they end up losing, well, their offseason will be not too far away, so we'll start to probably gain a little bit more clarity, but we could be into October really before we have a lot of answers once we hit the official full off season for the entire league. But clearly, Domi's not signed. We've heard comments from Bergevin before talking about that it wouldn't really be difficult to get a signing done. So the fact that it's not done, and obviously the way they're playing in the playoffs does cause some confusion in how they see him. At the same time, him playing fourth line duty and being less productive is going to also hurt his next contract. So hard to say where this is going, but what would the Penguins offer in return? I mean, if you look at what Montreal needs, I think they could benefit from another top center iceman. And if you take a look at what the Penguins would offer up if a deal like this were to be considered, I mean, from Montreal's perspective, I think they're probably either going to want a decent top left defenseman maybe, or a center who can play in the top six. If you look at what they have for centers right now, obviously I think Domi's probably better as a winger. I think they could use another top center. Obviously some of their young prospects who could be centers. Hard to say what their futures hold, but certainly some insulation in the interim. I mean, Phil Deneau's been a terrific two-way center, but ideally he's slotted number 2, number 3 in the right lineup. So if you look at what the Penguins have, I mean, clearly they're probably not getting that center iceman out of Pittsburgh. I mean, if you look at who their centers are, obviously Crosby, Malkin, they're not going to be moved. If you look at the blue line, I mean, I don't see a left defenseman really coming out of there. I mean, there's been some talk about maybe Crystal Tang, but he plays the right side and has some form of a no trade clause, so I don't see that happening. I mean, Montreal already has Weber and Petrie on the right side. It wouldn't make sense to bring Letang in, I don't think. Clearly, if you look at the left side, maybe Brian Dumoulin would probably be their best left shot defenseman. I can't see Montreal wanting Jack Johnson, so I don't really see that happening either. I mean, could they swap Domi for another forward? I mean, that's a possibility, but would Pittsburgh want to trade maybe either a Brian Rust or I'm not sure, maybe a Jared McCann, but I'm not sure exactly who would really be worthy, what would be a fair deal there, but I'm just not really sure that Domi as a Penguin to me makes a ton of sense. I can see Pittsburgh having some interest because obviously they clearly want to shake things up a bit, but I really don't know what they could give Montreal to really tempt them to make that move. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Does Friedman's thought here about possibly having Domi in a Penguins uniform next year make any sense to you? And if so, what kind of trade would make sense if it did happen? Now, I also took a look at an article in Sportsnet from Ken Weeb, who's discussing the Winnipeg Jets and what moves they could be making this offseason, discussing should they go down the road of a rebuild, do they really just need to retool? There's clearly going to be some pressure on GM Kevin Cheveldayoff, who's been the only GM since they returned to Winnipeg and their new franchise history, I guess we can say. And clearly, a couple years ago, they made a deep run in the playoffs, and in the last 2 years, they have regressed. I mean, this year you can say that obviously injuries played a big role in it, but there is some debate over how the Flames played. Would the Jets have won? I mean, I picked them to win. I think that they probably could have won had they been healthy, but clearly they weren't, and obviously they didn't happen. But it's clear that Winnipeg needs to improve in certain areas. They've been looking for a number 2 center. Feels like forever. I mean, they had a couple of years in the playoffs for the deadline when they went back-to-back years, where they acquired Paul Stastny and Kevin Hayes to play that role. Stastny fit in really well. But then left via free agency because they couldn't afford to match the kind of deal that Vegas was offering them. Kevin Hayes, on the other hand, didn't fit so well. He's a good player, but just wasn't exactly what they needed. And then he departed via free agency as well, signed that big deal with the Philadelphia Flyers. I mean, they've had Brian Little, who's battled a ton of injuries. It's unclear if he's even going to be able to play next year. He could still end up on long-term injury reserve, which in a way, if he's going to be out, would give them that potential LTIR cap relief if they wanted to spend more, so that would help as well. They could maybe buy out Matthew Perreault or trade him if possible to free up some additional cap space, because clearly Winnipeg's not serious trouble with the cap, but they certainly are not going to have a ton of space to go spending. They already have $65 million committed for next year, so that gives them around $16 million to settle out the rest of their roster, but they do have some other players that need to be signed. Their backup goalie, Brassois, needs a new contract, so they either need to re-sign him or replace him. They have some UFA defenders that they need to consider as well, including Dylan DeMello, who they acquired at the deadline. I think they've been pretty happy with him, but they're going to have to get a deal worked out. I'm not sure what he's going to cost, but I'm thinking probably $3 or $4 million. You're looking at Nathan Beaulieu as a UFA, Kulikov as a UFA. I can see them maybe letting Kulikov go. I think that would be possible, especially if they can make some upgrades through trade or free agency. They do have some young guys like Niku and Pullman looking for more opportunity. You also have Ville Heinola on the way from last year's draft. So they do have some young guys who can take on some roles, but again, like many young players, you don't want to play them higher in the lineup than you need to. But one thing that we'd suggest in this article is, could they go kind of like a big game hunting type of deal and go after Blues captain Alex Pietrangelo. I mean, clearly we don't know if he's going to stay in St. Louis or not, but with $16 million in cap space available, they could potentially create another $9+ million in space if Little stays on long-term reserve and Matthew Perreault is moved out or bought out. So with $9 extra million, they can certainly sign a couple of those defensemen, which isn't going to cost them too much money. Either sign Brossoit or go the route of another goalie as a backup. I mean, that's still going to give them enough room. They don't have a ton of guys in the forward group that need re-signing. And of course, as we know, the Jets did get some cap relief from Dustin Byfuglien, obviously, having that contract terminated. I think they'd rather have Buff playing, but clearly he's not there, and they need to replace him in some capacity. I mean, I know Pietrangelo's not the same kind of defenseman, but they really have had a mass exodus back there between Byfuglien and Sherrod and Myers, traded Trouba. They really need a big-time defender back there, and Pietrangelo could very well be that guy. But clearly, there is a strong possibility that St. Louis might find a way to re-sign him. I know they're going to be really tight on space, but if they make some necessary moves, maybe they can keep him there, sign a shorter-term deal as well, especially maybe take a little bit of a hometown discount. I don't know, but I mean, if Winnipeg comes calling with a lot of money, would he even entertain going to Winnipeg? Hard to say, but he would certainly be the kind of player they need. They could use a top pair right shot defenseman who would make a huge difference in their lineup. Absolutely. I mean, if you take a look at addressing other needs of the team, they could potentially sign him, get a backup goalie, sign, say, DeMello, for example, without costing too much, and still maybe even try to find another center iceman to play with the team. I mean, Jack Roslovic very well could turn out to be that number 2 center. And if I'm going to pick, if I can only address one of those needs because of cap issues between number 2 center and a top defenseman, I'm going for the top defenseman every time, depending on who I can get. But if I can get Pietrangelo on a deal, that's certainly something to heavily consider. So can you see Pietrangelo considering the Winnipeg Jets? Does it make sense that he would be the kind of player that they could go after? And do you think they actually have a legitimate shot at signing him should he make it to free agency? Now, I also want to touch quickly here on the Nashville Predators. We've seen comments recently from GM David Poile saying that there is definitely going to be changes made, that the results were unacceptable. He said some players definitely were not being brought back and that they just weren't good enough. Overall, he even said the coaching staff needed to coach better and the players needed to play better. So clearly he's frustrated. Ever since they went to the Stanley Cup Finals, they've been regressing, at least when it comes to their playoff results. I mean, they did win the President's Trophy the year after going to the finals, but then they did not have the playoff success that year, and they haven't found it ever since then. So it seems like they've been going backwards instead of forwards, even though he's made additional moves to try to improve the team on paper. I mean, if you look at their center depth, with like Ryan Johansson, Matt Duchene, Kyle Turris, they're Nick Bonino, even Colton Sissons can play center. Like, they really should be really stacked, but of course Turris has nothing but struggled in there. Johansson, even though he's a good center, I'm not sure he's an $8 million center, and he's not as offensive and doesn't provide as much of scoring as he should. Out of the three, the main one that struggled the most is Turris, and there's more talk again of can Poile revisit trading him or buying him out. I mean, a buyout would just be tied to him for so long. They gave him a 6-year contract when he first arrived. He still has 4 years left on that deal. So to buy him out, they'd have dead cap space for 8 years. Because obviously, with a buyout, in case you don't know, is you take 2/3 of the amount owing and it stretch it out over twice the amount of time left on the contract. So they'd have dead cap space for 8 years because of Kyle Turris, and they would save money in the short term, but then it would really just be a mess. Nashville's been a team who's been really against that. They don't really do salary retention or buyouts. It's something you just don't see them doing. Poile's never been a fan of that. He's been pretty good at managing his cap. He's got a lot of players signed to pretty good value long-term deals, like Victor Arvidsson. I mean, that deal's looking phenomenal right now. You got guys like Yarn Croak and Sissons. Like, their contracts are pretty good. I mean, Yossi's contract kicks in next year. Obviously, he went way up to a $9 million defenseman, but really, he's played extremely well, been a great captain, and is one of the top 5 defensemen in the NHL, in my opinion. So clearly, I think he deserves that contract, but it kind of puts him in a difficult spot to address other areas of the team. But they have some UFAs like Granlund and Smith, who both had their offensive numbers drop this year and had very disappointing playoffs. They only had 1 goal in the playoffs between them. Granlund had 1. Smith had no points. So obviously, that's not good. So Granlund, Smith, and Turris would be the most likely players to not come back to Nashville next year. Of course, 2 of them are UFAs, so they're not going to get anything in return. And then, of course, like I said, for Turris, it's not going to be easy to do. I mean, even with salary retained, maybe, but then they're still going to be tied to something. But a retention of 40-50% of his contract and have that on the books for another 4 years as compared to buying him out and having dead space for 8 years, probably long term would be better. But even then, is that going to happen? It's certainly debatable. David Poile has his work cut out for him for sure. Clearly, they need to make changes. It's not going to be easy, but let me know what you think is likely. What players don't return for Nashville, and can he finally find a way to move on from that tourist contract that has just never worked out? So, of course, as always, want to know your thoughts and opinions on everything discussed here today, and we can discuss further down in the comment section. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.